Hello, welcome to this REF 2029 Town Hall. We're here to talk about the updated Codes of Practice guidance today in this session, which is kind of focused on output selection and is really closely connected with the recently published CKU policy module. If you're watching the recorded version of this Town Hall, would recommend that you watch the associated Town Hall covering the rest of the Code of Practice guidance, as well as these two pieces are complementary. And in this session, we'll be focused on what has been updated in the most recent kind of policy publication. The intention is that that Town Hall will finish at 2 or in about an hour for anyone who's not watching it live. And Rebecca and I will run through some background and then the guidance update in detail. And then finally, we plan to have quite a substantial amount of time available for questions, and we'll get into those as much as we can. We'll be focusing on questions concerning the Codes of Practice update as far as possible, and you know, we'll kind of curate questions with that in mind. We know it's highly related to the CKU policy module, but there will be a town hall on that next week as well, with further opportunity for questions. Okay, so and I'm Jonathan Petrosky, and I'm the head of REF Policy. I should introduce myself, and Rebecca, would you mind introducing yourself as well?
Oh yes, hi, I'm Rebecca Emmett. I'm a senior policy advisor in the policy team.
Super. So as this is going to be published as a resource, I'm going to do some of the compulsory framing we always have to do in the exercise. I know you all know this, but do forgive me. The REF is owned and led by the 4 UK higher education funding bodies. It informs about £2 billion of block grant funding each year, and it provides really important accountability for that public investment in research. And the REF continually evolves and has done historically alongside our research base to reflect excellence and to reflect a developing sector. And given that connection to funds, it really it drives behaviour in the sector and is a really significant policy instrument across the UK. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm not going to focus on the first two of these boxes, but I would like to highlight the third in the context of you know, the discussion today, as we often talk about achieving a balance in the exercise. And in the development of REF 2029, 3 priorities were developed through consultation with the sector and with experts and using evaluation from the last exercise as well. And we really use those 3 priorities to help drive decision making and finding the balance of policy in the exercise. And those 3 areas and 3 priorities are the robustness of assessment outcomes, the impact on the system on research culture, and ensuring that the bureaucratic burden of the system is proportionate. And quite often we find that those factors form a triangle which we have to balance against each other, and there's many different ways of kind of slicing that, but it is about trying to find the right balance. Okay, I think next slide, and over to you, Rebecca.
Right, cheers, thanks, Jonathan. So just to start with, an overview of what the Code of Practice, or the COP, is, and we'll probably call it COP for quite a lot of this session. So for REF 2029, having an approved COP is a mandatory requirement for all HEIs, all higher education institutions that wish to participate. And so the Code of Practice sets a minimum standard for participation, ensuring that all submissions meet certain criteria and guidelines. And it's essential as part of that process that the Code of Practice is approved by the funding bodies to ensure compliance and standardisation across the sector. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Say next slide, please, but I have control. There we go. So the Codes of Practice go beyond procedural and legislative compliance and aim to embed a framework of principles throughout the key decisions made by HEIs that shape their REF 2029 submissions. And as Jonathan's mentioned, we have the core principles for the exercise, but we also have 3 core principles for the Code of Practice, and that you can see on the screen. The first of those is robustness. This principle ensures that submissions are an accurate reflection of the sector that supports confidence in the outcomes of the REF and related funding decisions. The second being transparency. So it's crucial that the decision-making processes are clear and understandable, and the transparent processes help to reassure the sector that the same rules are being followed everywhere by everybody. And finally, we've got equity and inclusion. So decisions about your submissions should be fair and impartial, supporting a diversity of people and research. So the Code of Practice promotes inclusive research environments where diverse contributions are valued and supported. So we've had 2 sets of guidance on the Code of Practice that's been published over the past few months. So the first module was the volume measure guidance, which was published back in January 2025. You can cast your minds back 6 months or longer if you're watching this on the video. And that provides guidance on identifying contracts with significant responsibility for research and for how to determine research independence. More recently, we had the output selection guidance, or the contributions to knowledge and understanding module, which was published in June, which provides guidance on the selection of research outputs for submission to REF 2029. Over to you, Jonathan.
Super. And I remember to unmute, which is obviously great. We thought we'd highlight this particular point in the guidance, which says that all of the guidance will be formally finalised in 2026. So all of the REF 2029 guidance, we finalised them. And guidance modules may be subject to small revisions in the interim. And I think that's just a sort of layout that we don't envisage making substantial change to the Code of Practice guidance or the other guidance that has been published, but we may make clarifications where that is necessary. And actually, events like today and the feedback and engagements that we're doing in the sector really help us understand where there are where perhaps there's need for that kind of clarification. So very grateful for your input. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the first update that I'm going to share with you, and I guess it's the first time that there is a public viewing of this information, and that is that, as stated in the Code of Practice, there are 4 sort of specified windows and approval timings for the Codes of Practice, where institutions will submit their Codes of Practice to the funding bodies, and there will be an approval process, and that's as we've kind of written in the Code of Practice guidance. We sent out a survey to all of our institutional contacts and all of our technical contacts for institutions across the UK, and I think there was around about 18% of respondents said that a further time is needed to achieve approval, and that none of the existing windows are feasible. So we are exploring an additional window to be added in summer 2026. I don't have any more detail beyond that at this time, but just to let you know, I guess in response to that survey, and to recognise that around 1/5 of respondents thought it necessary, we are exploring that and intend to find a suitable timing in the summer for that additional window. In general, we anticipate that it will take around about 3 months for approval, up to 3 months, I should say, hopefully less. It depends on the kind of number of Codes of Practice that's submitted in each of the windows, and I guess the funding bodies have some work to do to kind of process those and provide that approval. Okay, next slide, please.
And that would be me, sorry. So the other update that's important to flag at this stage in the Code of Practice policies, again, following feedback and engagement with the sector, there has been a small update relating to research independence. So feedback from our previous town hall on Code of Practice and sector engagement raised that the appeals process that was outlined in the previous version of the policy related to the determining of research independence is unnecessary in cases where the job role explicitly is to support the research programme of another researcher. And so we've heard that, and we've therefore updated the requirements related to appeals processes for research independence decisions to clarify and make it clear that these roles would not be in scope for any required appeals processes. I would just flag that there is a very detailed change log attached to the policy on the website, so you can see everything that has been updated and changed, and refer back and if it's of interest to you. So that's what's changed. I'm going to start running through three sets of policies and procedures that are required in the Code of Practice relating to the selection of outputs. Then I'm going to pass over to Jonathan for another three, just so you don't have to listen to me for the whole time. So I'm going to start with the 12.5 in the Code of Practice guidance, which refers to policies and procedures for identifying substantive link to outputs. So this requires a fair and transparent process to identify substantive links in relation to the selection of outputs. So specifically, this is addressing the identification of eligible employment relationships, which are 0.2 FTE for a minimum of 12 months. So it's policies to ensure that threshold is met alongside the expectation of research activity, which is the two sides of the substantive link. It also, these policies also need to include details for any exceptional circumstances where permission might be sought for outputs to be submitted where they are authored by those on excluded contracts, and we would expect to see that addressed within the 12.5 policies and procedures section. So the next set of policies and procedures is 12.6. So these are those relating to the selecting of outputs where the substantive link is via a former staff member. So there are two sets of kind of timings for this. There's the first is where outputs were published by former staff members during their eligible employment relationship. So that's one time period. The second time period is where the former staff member had left but had previously had an eligible employment relationship, but the publication was first put out into the public domain after that employment relationship was over. So that's the pre-publication substantive link circumstance. So what you will need to include in the Code of Practice are the policies and procedures for the selection of these outputs that are fair and transparent and relate to both of these time periods and various groups of staff, including those subject to compulsory redundancy, noting that in that circumstance, the pre-publication substantive link is explicitly excluded. But then also policies for those related, selected for voluntary redundancy or severance, for retired staff, and also for staff who have left at the end of a fixed term contract. So we would expect policies and procedures in all of those circumstances to be laid out within your Code of Practice. And then the third policy that I want to outline is the policy and procedures for assigning outputs to units of assessment. So REF recognises that HEIs are the best placed to know where to assign an output, so which unit of assessment to submit it to, but also that a single output might be submitted to multiple UOAs where it meets the standards for multiple units of assessment. So the Code of Practice ought to outline the policies and procedures for this, and specifically considering how interdisciplinary research is approached within those policies and procedures. Over to you, Jonathan.
Fab. Thank you. Yes, so carrying on from where Rebecca left off in terms of the policies and procedures for selection of outputs for submission, the next requirement is around procedures for supporting diversity of outputs. It's an important priority in this exercise. And we institutions should outline how procedures have enabled and supported diverse output types in their disciplinary context and how they've been considered for selection. And it should also include a description of the processes used to encourage and recognise diverse research outputs and how this reflects their commitment to responsible research assessment. I feel like that's relatively straightforward, so I shan't talk about that too much. And perhaps if you could move on to the next slide. I think maybe spend a bit more time on this particular item, which is about procedures for ensuring submissions are representative of the research undertaken within the submitting unit during the REF period. So this This policy area has been developed for REF 2029 and was outlined in the initial decisions. And I will spend some time now talking through the detail and the expectations. I think this policy has been developed in the context of a decoupled framework, separation of the volume measure and the submission of individuals and the outputs selected for submission, and that focus on institutional assessment. That again, we kind of outlined in the initial decisions, and we've developed further in the CKU module, where we've provided some more context around that. And the town hall next week, looking at the CKU guidance, we'll get a bit more into the policy detail around that. However, the intention is that the submission will be assessed on the extent that submissions will be assessed on the extent that they are representative of the research undertaken by the submitting unit during the REF period, and they should reflect the range of research activity in the UOA. And that representative submissions will be assessed as part of the disciplinary level statements, and that full guidance on this is in development, and will require working with the REF 2029 panels to think about disciplinary differences. And I think that's connected to the ask for institutions in the code of practice and how we've framed it, and the way that what we've asked for in here, and the fact that institutions are being asked to develop their codes of practice now, due to the need to coincide code of practice development with the HESA staff data schedule. So I think we need to acknowledge there's a bit of a timing mismatch there, but we've tried to accommodate that by requiring that institutions are only being asked to outline how, what are the procedures that will be used for ensuring that submissions are representative of the submitting unit during the REF period. So it's a focus on the procedures, and notably missing is the policies around that as well. And I think that means that this requirement is connected to the general guidance around procedures, which can be found later in the code of practice guidance. We asked that codes of practice to outline a transparent, robust, and equitable and inclusive process, and that the procedures should outline how the indicators of representation will be considered in submissions. I won't go through the indicators now. I'm sure you can read those. So I guess it's again focusing in that the fact we're expecting codes of practice to outline how institutions are going to approach this. And I guess the point of that is that the codes of practice are really a document between institutions and their staff, and to promote transparency, and for it to be open as to how submissions are developed. So move on to the next slide. And this is the final one of this sort of quite dense section. And this particular clause outlines that policies and procedures are required to be outlined in the code of practice around responsible research assessment practice. So it states that the funding bodies expect institutions to adopt responsible research assessment practices in the selection of the outputs. We're not prescriptive of a particular approach, but we do encourage institutions to look at established frameworks which many higher education institutions are already signatories for, such as DORA or COARA. And I know there's some great work going on already thinking about what that means. And another important clause is that institutions should explain how they do or do not use quantitative indicators in decision making, and how that aligns with those broader research assessment values. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so focusing on the EIA guidance. Again, in our engagements and in our town hall, arising from the first public part of the code of practice guidance that was published, we were asked to provide more guidance on conducting an EIA for REF 2029, and in particular how it aligns with legal obligations and responsibilities in exercising the public functions. And it's important to remember that it is guidance, and it's designed to support institutions to conduct an EIA in their own context. It's not the only guidance out there, and there's other useful guidance available, including from the EHRC or the Equality Commission in Northern Ireland. Yes, I focused in on the key messages that were outlined in the guidance. And I think the one that stands out to me the most is that the focus is on institutional process, and that throughout consistently should be the focus of the EIA. And again, that's to reflect the fact that it is supposed to be it is a decoupled framework and a decoupled assessment focused on institutional assessment, and therefore the focus of the EIA is on institutional process. I won't go into any more detail than that. I think there possibly are some questions about what it means that the EIA is a live document, and that the EIA may be revisited. And I think that the guidance does actually give quite a good outline of how to approach that during the development of policies and procedures, and throughout and at the conclusions, that it mirrors the development of the exercise and is an ongoing consideration in the decisions being made. Okay, I think, is that back over to you now?
That is me. Yeah, so I'm just going to very briefly talk about the Code of Practice template, which you can find if you scroll down to the bottom of the guidance page. You'll find the link there to download the document. So that has been updated to include the CKU contributions to knowledge and understanding elements of the Code of Practice, the policies and procedures section that we've just outlined. We've had a few consistent queries that have come up around the template, so I thought it was probably worth just mentioning them here, so that might sort of already answer burning questions that are already within the group. So the expectation is that the template will be used to structure the Code of Practice as submitted for approval, whilst acknowledging that some institutions may also have other sections that they include in other documents that are made available to their staff or through their websites, but the Code of Practice should be submitted to us using the template. And that all elements of that template ought to be included in that Code of Practice that's submitted for approval. So where one of the questions that has arisen is where the EIA might sit in that, and you'll see if you look at the template, the EIA can be included as an appendices at the end, but also should be referenced throughout in the sections talking about the different processes and policies and procedures that are outlined within the template. I would also mention that there will be an update to the template shortly, because there is a space missing for the sort of specific space for the policies and procedures relating to the assigning of contracts to UOAs has been omitted, and we'll be adding that back in, but it will sit between sections 3 and 4 if anybody is interested right now, but that update will be done shortly, so that template will be fully usable very soon. So that, I think, brings me on to the last slide, Jonathan, which is yours.
Yes, okay. Thank you. I didn't have anything prepared for this slide, but there's a lovely QR code that you can use that will sign you up to our ref updates straight to your inbox, and that does say whenever anything is updated. So please do sign up to that. We've actually got an incorrect bullet point that shows how much attention we've paid to this slide, which says there'll be a PC webinar. Well, there isn't. Unfortunately, we've just carried that over from the last town hall, so never mind. But the last one does remain true, and that you can email us as at info@ref.ac.uk if you've got any suggestions or questions, and I'm sure you will use that resource. So thank you. Thanks very much for joining us, and I think we'll move on to the Q&A side of things. I don't know, Rebecca, if you're able to stop sharing your screen, and Sylvie, are you going to be the voice from behind the stage which shouts the questions out? Yeah.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so the first one is around the window. Does the 3-month window for approval include time for clarification and updating the COP following feedback from the panels?
That's the intention. I guess we that's what we're based upon the last exercise, and the process is there. I think that's a reasonable estimation. I think if it gets complex, it might be quicker if it's simple, and if it gets complex, then we will try and avoid that, obviously. So I wouldn't think it's a hard, fast rule, but the intention is that it's done and dusted 3 months, inclusive of everything.
Great, thank you. And can I just check for the additional window, are you planning to announce that soon, or is that something that might be added further down the line next summer? The details around the additional window.
Yeah, I get you. Yes, we will be releasing the details soon. We know it will be in summer 2026, but we'll get that date set sooner rather than later, so you've got a target.
Thank you. We've had a couple of questions around appeals. So somebody said an appeals process isn't necessary in cases where the job description is clear that the role is to support the research of others. Does this mean that we also do not need to notify these staff of their independent status?
With this one, Jonathan, please do correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's important that staff are aware whether they are considered independent or not. The difference being that if you are a research assistant, the expectation will be that you are there to support the programme of research of another researcher, if that is the expectation of that job role. But I can see there's a sort of a second half of this question is why is there an appeals process necessary at all? And actually, whilst it's an appeals process, it's about staff understanding whether they are considered, their contract is considered to have a significant responsibility for research or research independence, rather than whether that contract is eligible for inclusion in the volume measure. That is an important thing for them to be aware of, for understanding their career trajectory and what is going on in relation to the expectations on them. So it's less about whether that contract is included in the REF volume calculation and more about what their role is and what their function is. I don't think there's anything else to add there, is there, Jonathan?
Not for me.
Right, thank you. So the next one was, how should universities account for practices connected to the remit of a code of practice, i.e. mock REF exercises, identifying SRR, which have taken place between REF 21 and the new COP guidance, now a new code practice now being produced for REF 29?
That's a good question. I feel like I need a bit more detail on that. I don't know, Becky, do you have any immediate reflections on that? I think I don't know whether I'm missing the crux of the question or not, but I'm not entirely sure. We don't have anything in the guidance about that. And I guess if there's any underpinning questions, perhaps it's just worth the question submitted getting in contact, and we can get into it in a bit more detail.
Right, yeah, we'll try and get to that if you want to put back in a bit more detail. Thank you. So 2 questions we're going to put together here. How should research undertaken by the unit be defined, and who defines a submitting unit?
There is a definition of submitting unit that I'm just trying to pull up so that I don't give the wrong language. Jonathan may beat me there.
I won't, because I haven't started going there. So
fair enough. So the submitting unit, now this, spoiler alert, it is from the Contribution to Knowledge and Understanding policy module. It is at paragraph 7.0.4. So a submitting unit comprises the collection of subject structures, research groups and research activity in an HEI submitting to a UOA. So the HEI has is best placed to know who and what they consider is included in a submitting unit. So I would point you to that point within that policy in the first instance, but there was 2 parts of that question. Oh, and who defines? It's the HEI applying the guidance. would be the most appropriate in that scenario. Is there anything you'd add to that one, Jonathan?
No, I think that makes sense. I think the way we've tried to approach it is recognizing that each institution is has are different, and they have their own contexts, and the ref needs to have sufficient flexibility to support institutions to submit in a meaningful way, so we do think it is down to the institution to define what a submitting unit looks like, and we've given those broad parameters within the CKU guidance. And it will look different for each institution. So I guess we're getting down to that point where it's hard for the ref to define these things when there's so much variation.
Thank you. The next question is that some procedures have not been thought about in detail by some HEIs yet and will likely evolve, potentially veering away from early thinking outlined in COP. How generic can the procedures described in COP be to allow for this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think that it doesn't need to be to the tiniest level of detail, and in fact, the sort of the expectations of what should be outlined come under section 13 of the guidance, where it sets out the key kind of requirements. Yeah, I mean, I think that it needs to be enough detail so that for that staff within the institution can understand how decisions are being made about the exercise. That's the primary purpose of the code of practice, and that that those principles of transparency and the other principles are visible, and it's clear to staff that they're being adhered to. So yeah, it's difficult to give a sort of a degree of specificity, but I would say that follow the section 13. I think gives us sort of a clear indication of and section 12 as to what the required content is of a code of practice. Is there anything you'd add, Rebecca?
Not on that one, no. I don't think so.
Okay, thank you. We've got one on representativeness now. Why are we required to publish analysis of how we have achieved representativeness and if this was successful in the COP? That would be before the selection actually occurs, and our approach will evolve.
So this is actually a question about the CKU guidance, not about the Code of Practice guidance. And I think that I will just, for anybody looking to find where that is, it's in 7.2.3. It's the approach that is outlined in your Code of Practice is one thing. And then on the other side, it's the analysis of the extent of the success of that approach. And I will defer to Jonathan in a moment if there's anything else he wants to add. But the analysis of the extent of the success of the approach is a sort of a post-match analysis, not to be published with the Code of Practice. So they're two separate things rather than something being published before you've undertaken the selection process. So I think there's just a slight misunderstanding of that clause there, but possibly we can clarify that within the CKU town hall next week to make sure that that's not a widespread worry. Is there anything you'd add, Jonathan?
No, thank you. That's I think that's a good quick response to that. Thanks, Rebecca. I mean, if you want more discussion on it, then obviously feel free to get in contact. We'll be happy to have a conversation.
Okay, great, thank you. So the next one is, will we need to resubmit COPs when a new EIA is added?
We anticipate that the EIA will be conducted as described in the guidance in a way that supports the development and finalisation of the code of practice. We anticipate that it would just be submitted once, unless I guess there's substantial change beyond that approved version. We don't anticipate that multiple iterations of the EIA would need to be submitted. Just a final concluding version that goes along with the proposed final code of practice.
Thank you. I've got a question about procedure or representative. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I suppose, obviously there is a couple of lines in the code of practice about them becoming, live documents in the longer term, and I guess we're not, that hasn't been fully developed with the funding bodies as to what that looks like. I think there's quite a bit of work to get into, what we want from that in the longer term, and so if the EIA question is related to that, then we don't have that information at this point. Sorry, Sylvie, didn't mean to interrupt. I just thought that might be useful.
No, that's great. Thank you. I think that one was more anyway. So I was going to ask next, if there are several staff in a UOA with an equal basis for proving the substantive link, e.g., is it always selecting one at random acceptable in the COP, or are more detailed processes needed? If not, what criteria can we apply?
This is an interesting one because there'll be bound to be plenty of outputs where there are multiple substantive ways of proving a substantive link to a UOA, and I think it's perfectly reasonable for every HEI to be doing this differently, depending on what you feel is appropriate. You may choose to go with alphabetical order, quite reasonably, I think is. Or I mean, I don't think ultimately as long as you can demonstrate your substantive link, that is what is the most important element of that substantive link policy. If you have multiple substantive links, then splendid. But yes, I don't think that there's any issue with using a random selection process.
No, there's no requirement, is there, set out in the guidance. I guess again, I think putting that sort of framing of the decoupled framework and institutional assessment, it's the aim of a big shift, I think, in the CKU guidance and the corresponding code of practice guidance is that shift away from that link to individuals that you had submitted individuals that you had in previous exercises. So I think as long as there is what we ask for in the substantive link is a link between the HEI and the research that's submitted in the form of an output. So I don't think we want to be prescriptive about what that looks like, just that there is that link and that the institution has supported that research.
Great, thank you. And please let me know if you can't hear me. Sorry, I'm having some internet issues. But the next one was there will be circumstances where a contracting arrangement with a university may not quite fit the standard definition of substantive link. The guidance suggests to include outputs from these situations. We need to get each approved by the REF director. How will this work in practice as it could lead to a large volume of approvals?
Yes, good. Yeah, sorry, you did put in a little bit out there, Sylvie, but yeah, I think we're okay. Yes, so I think you're talking about the kind of exceptions outlined in the CKU policy. We haven't outlined the process for approvals of those kind of exemptions yet. We anticipate they'll form part of our sort of special request process where we'll look at other similar kind of exceptions and alterations and amendments to submissions, like small unit requests, multiple submissions, and those kind of things. So we don't have that detail yet. I guess we see it as being an exception to the rule, and we would anticipate managing it in that kind of way, but full detail to follow, I guess. Anything you'd say, Rebecca? Does that seem fair?
No, I think that is fair because it is part of that special request process that is on the agenda.
Thank you. So will the template include a section on impact?
Oh dear, got a bit patchy signal.
And selection of outputs?
It's a little bit patchy in terms of signal, but I think that question is, will the template include a section on impact case studies? And for staff involved in these, the selection of an ICS is far more significant to careers than the selection of outputs. Given this, in our draft, we have been developing part 5 on selecting ICS, which we assume is acceptable. So we did talk about this, and I guess the ratio of impact case studies to the volume, I think made it increasingly a difficult thing to really do meaningfully in terms of the codes of practice, and also would have, I think created a change that we hadn't anticipated for this exercise that wasn't planned. I think that if an institution wanted to define a code of practice around the selection of the impact case studies, then that we wouldn't have any qualms or problems with that whatsoever. We wouldn't have an assessment process for it, though, as we haven't set out any rules for it. And I guess it would be something that an institution would independently decide to take on, in addition to the sort of guidance set out. So that's my take. I don't know if you've got anything to add, Rebecca.
No, that sounds like it covers it.
Okay, so I'm going to read the question out to you now, Rebecca, if that's okay.
Yes,
hopefully it's a good one. How can EIAs include impact at the point of submission, as we won't have run all of our processes at that point? Is that what you mean by living document, that we would be updating the EIA when we can?
So there's two things there, isn't there? There's the living document, the code of practice becoming a living document, and then there's the EIA that sits alongside it. So as Jonathan, as you talked about earlier, the living document side of the code of practice is something that will be sort of followed up on later on in the process. The EIAs obviously can be informed as the process is run. So the analysis that is done at the start of the design of the code of practice can take into account as much as possible impacts, and yes, could be updated alongside the code of practice, but there would be a point at which you would send in the EIA and the code of practice for approval, but at which point that would be a snapshot of what is known at the time. And yes, as I think, Jonathan, you already mentioned, updating the EIA alongside the code of practice several years down the line is a perfectly reasonable and sensible way for those two documents to interact. Is there anything else you'd add on that one?
Yeah, I mean, just to reflect that HIs must submit a final EIA after the submission deadline, including that final analysis. So there is that expectation that institutions do wrap it up in terms of the final submission and have that reflection submitted, and that more information is going to be provided on that requirement. It was also a requirement for REF 2021, I think. So I think that should be a similar process there. But as the guidance states, more information will be provided in due course on that requirement.
Shall I read you a question?
Oh, yes, please, go on then.
Thank you. Right, so since the HEI's code of practice will be drafted before the guidance is potentially firmed up, how does that affect the HEI's code of practice post-approval if it is felt clarifications are needed to the code of practice? Would the HEI be able to make tweaks to the code of practice without having to go through approvals again?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. I think that we have to establish a good degree of flexibility and understanding, and that we want to kind of work with the sector to kind of get codes of practice in place in the spirit that they're kind of intended. We haven't set out guidance on the kind of extent around sort of future updates beyond approval. I think that's something that we do need to do, but I guess my inclination at this point is that we want to be able to just support institutions to work in a way that is feasible for them and that supports them to get through the REF process and establish a meaningful code of practice. So I've waffled around it a little bit there, but I think that we need that. I think the principle of it should be that we should do something that is not onerous and supportive. But I guess there's a sort of there's probably a bit of a balance to strike in what that looks like in reality, and we'll have to work with the funding bodies around what the future kind of codes of practice looks like and how we enter into that phase, and so there's more to come on this, I think, in terms of that. But good question, thank you. Okay, so I think, are we over to 15? Is that right? Just to make sure I'm not jumping. Yes. Okay, super. So is it okay to submit an EIA on output selection in the codes of practice without analysis of outcome, given we won't be selecting any outputs yet?
Of course, that sort of gets tied into the question previously that you flagged the fact that there will be a final EIA at the end of the process. So yes, on the understanding that the EIA will be updated and submitted at the end of the submission process as well, as in REF 2021. So hopefully that's a sort of quick answer there. Which means I can ask you one, which is, can you say any more about what is required for an EIA regarding the allocation of staff to UOAs? Since it's not clear to the poster what the equality implications of this actually are.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's not quite the topic of this update session, but I'm happy to sort of give it a quick kind of addressing anyway. I guess as with the rest of the EIA, it's focused on the process, and I would keep coming back to that to make sure that the process is assessing the quality impacts of the process, and I think that would be the same for the allocation of eligible contracts to UOAs, which I think is what the question submitter is getting at.
So I think I'm just reflecting some of the questions around this came up in some of the deep dives and engagements that we've done in the sector. There was a concern about some contracts being diverted away from certain subject areas rather than submitted to others for less than sort of solid reasons potentially. And so it's about making sure that the contracts are going to an appropriate UOA for appropriate reasons rather than for less sort of robust reasons as well. I think that's where the process really comes in. Is there a clear rationale and a clear process that's considering that? And maybe that might help to kind of clarify the thinking behind that. Possibly.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful.
So I've lost track of what number we're on. I think we're on 17. So given that we need to notify all staff of their independent status, there's a concern about burden if there are a huge number of staff. Can we communicate with staff on the same contract collectively?
Yeah, I don't think we've set any requirements about personalized or individual kind of communications on it. So I think that given the scale, that would seem like a pretty reasonable approach to me. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Rebecca. I mean, I suppose my other instinct is that as long as there's clear information and people have where appeals are appropriate, have the right information about that, then that seems in line with the guidance as far as I can see.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that the important thing is where you have outliers, who maybe all of your research assistants do not have research independence, But where you do have some that do, ensuring that you have a process for identifying them and informing them accurately of that their particular contract does not necessarily adhere to the fact that all other research assistants within your institution are not research independent. Making sure that you are accurately giving them that information is probably the most important consideration there. But yeah, that was the end of the question. Oh, sorry, it's your turn to ask a question. I was ducking out of answering it.
Yeah, you've lined yourself up for a further question. There is confusion regarding whether our best research outputs should be submitted or whether outputs should be representative. Full stop.
Okay.
Oh, no, full stop actually, but yeah.
I think that's been edited in live time on Teams there. Again, I think this is more of a CKU question than a code of practice question, and I think we'll possibly go into it in more detail at the next town hall. But again, it is a balance. If outputs need to reflect the research, the excellent research that's going on within the submitting unit, but also should be representative of all of those areas of research. So there ought to be representative submissions that have outputs from all of the different areas that are being looked into by that submitting unit. So it's a balance that institutions are going to be wanting to strike, and I think that's probably something we can talk about in a little bit more depth next week. I anticipate there'll be more questions on it. Unless there's anything you want to add now.
No, I think you're right, and I think that immediately struck me was that it is a balance, and it is asking institutions to kind of do both of those things, actually, and find the right balance for that. Yeah, thank you. Are you going to read the next question, Rebecca?
Oh yes, I will. Yeah. So in terms of using the template, do we have to populate the template in the Word document and adhere to the subsection numbering? The structure is not sufficient for explaining our processes.
Thank you. What did we say last time on this one, Rebecca? We said that yes, please use the template and its structure as far as is possible. Is that kind of what we said? So I think simplicity is probably helpful, but I do recognise that institutions will need to outline their context and explain the kind of information that we've required in the code of practice guidance. If you absolutely feel as though the clearest way is not through the standardized format, then I guess that will be okay. I think probably have a degree of flexibility, but I think overall would encourage institutions to kind of stick to the format where possible. I think it will make assessment easier for the funding bodies and actually sort of outcomes more easy to compare. So I think where possible, I think that would be great. Anything you'd add, Rebecca?
No, I think that's very fair. I think the template tells you what's going to be looked for, and so it is always useful to signpost the things that are going to be looked for in the order that they're going to be looked for when the approval process is being undertaken. So where possible, using the template would definitely be appreciated. Yeah.
Okay, I've completely lost my track. What number are we on?
I think we're on question 20.
20. Yes. Okay. Are codes of practice from REF 2021 still worth looking at as a resource for how to do a code of practice? Institutions may need some support to understand what good looks like. Is that something the funders are going to provide?
I think in the first instance, yes, they are useful resources, acknowledging that the ask is different this time, so they are not total sort of illustrations of what good would look like. I don't actually know if the funders are going to provide additional guidance. Sorry, Jonathan, that's one for you.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's no intention at this point for additional guidance. I would say that there's a really great, strong report from the last exercise from REF 2021 from EDAP, which actually who read every code of practice submitted to the last exercise and who gave guidance on what good looked like, and where there were common trappings, and where things were done well. So I think my first protocol would be to look at that EDAP report, and maybe, I don't know whether we can post that as a resource on the website related near our guidance or in some way, but as an institution, yeah, you probably could just Google EDAP report and codes of practice for 2021, and I'm sure you'll find it quite easily, or you can navigate through our website to get there. But that's the starting point that I would suggest. There have been some changes, like we've slimmed down some of the reporting requirements for this exercise. So I think it's worth looking, I think, at the overall sort of principles of what made a good code of practice, and thinking about that rather than the kind of the ins and outs, I would say.
So the next question is linked to the appeals process. Could we say more on why it's considered important for research staff to know whether they're considered to have research independence? For REF purposes, it seems to go against decoupling and lead to the potential for this to be used by individuals as a status for other purposes.
Yeah, it's an interesting debate, and I think it's something we've spent some time thinking about and discussing, and I guess there is a bit of a kind of a tension there, and I understand. With the decoupled framework, and the sort of calculation of volume sort of done in what's intended to be quite automatically through through HESA data, I guess it does become more of a kind of just a tally up of relevant FTE. But I guess as we're moving towards that as the ongoing means by which we'll kind of look at volume, and that as a proxy for research capacity in the sector, I think that actually some of things like significant responsibility for research and research independence are still connected to people. They are still meaningful things that relate to people and their careers, and as such, we feel as though that having that kind of appeals process is important, because inevitably this will be connected into kind of workload allocation and things that will directly impact people. So we think, for this exercise, at least in terms of it being the one that introduces this kind of the volume measure and the decoupled framework, we think it's important to retain that protection for people and their careers. So that's the rationale. I understand the other side of that perspective, and we have a decoupled framework, kind of an institutional assessment suggests that's the focus of the REF, but I think we still have to think about the people in there who are tied to these kind of REF phrases and kind of meanings. So yeah, that's where we're coming from with that. I see we're at 1 minute to close, so I might suggest that we wrap up there, and just to say a big thank you for coming along to this town hall. We intend to publish this as a lasting resource, and we'll have another one of these next week on CKU, and it will be a similar thing to expect. Thank you for all your questions. Thank you for all your consideration, and thanks for taking the time to come along. And we'll be looking to sort of look at ways that we engage with the sector, in more detail, and through our InfoRef inbox going forward. So thanks everyone, and thanks Rebecca, thanks Sylvie, and take care.
Thanks.